My name is Matthew Vashur. I run BibleProtector.com. Today we're looking at Greatsite.com Exposed, talking about the 1769 edition of the King James Bible. The King James Bible has been printed over the years since 1611 many times, and in 1769 Dr. Benjamin Blaneys, he did a particular editorial work on the King James Version, and that has sort of been regarded as a standard edition. However, there are issues with that, and we know that since that time, for example, Cambridge University Press has brought out editions that have corrections, and even Oxford was correcting their own work there at the Oxford University Press. And today, the standard edition of the King James Version, as far as having it accurate in every place, in every way, that's the pure Cambridge edition. That's what we stand for, and that's where you can go to BibleProtector.com and download there. So I've looked at the 1769 edition. I went to the State Library of Victoria, for example, and here's some handwritten writing that's in the inside of the cover of that one that's there, and that shows that I certainly do know what I'm talking about. Very interestingly, in this handwriting, someone has made some corrections. For example, the person wrote Dr. Benjamin Blaneys, and they spelled it B-L-A-N-E-Y, and someone's written a Y into the word Blaneys, so it's B-L-A-Y-N-E-Y, because that is the proper spelling of Blaneys. As you can see in another part of the writing, it's spelt that way. So anyway, I've made some videos about the 1769 edition, and also, of course, a lot about the pure Cambridge edition, and studied it and written about it. And one thing I talked about was how Wikipedia was adopting the 1769 edition as its standard, and in fact how laughable that really is, as far as there's errors and mistakes and problems there. This video will go into a little bit of detail about that. So in the comments to that video, someone called RMS Ministries put a comment there saying, "For those interested, Greatsite.com sells a reproduction facsimile of the Blaneys 1769 folio edition." Now, the fact is that there's known to be two editions of Blaneys' work from 1769. One is in a quarto edition, and one is in the folio, which is the full-size big lectern type Bible. And so those are specifically the ones that have his corrections in it. We'll see a little bit more about that momentarily. So the select committees were formed in the 1830s to investigate the printing history of the King James Bible by the British Parliament, and in England and perhaps also from Scotland, people were testifying there at the select committee, and this is Reverend A. Thompson in 1837. He was asked by Mr. Hume, "Do you know in what estimation the edition of Blaneys is held in England?" And Reverend Thompson says, "I know that it is regarded both in England and Scotland as by far the most accurate edition, but neither is it perfect by any means." Now he's, of course, probably meaning that he disregards or thinks there's some translation problems with the King James Bible. Well, that's not what we're talking about. It is, however, correct to say that it is not a perfect edition, because, yes, there was mistakes when Blaneys made that, and we're going to look at that. So this is Blaneys' own testimony, and he talks about when the quarto sheets were printed off. This is when he was making the first printing. The quarto is a big size Bible, not the biggest size, but a pretty big size. He says when they were printed off, the forms were lengthened out in order to make up the folio edition, in doing which the parts were often so jumbled together, etc., etc. And then he talks about making a new, basically doing a whole new editorial process to make the folio edition. And so in doing that, he in fact found some more errors and things like that, and thinks, as it says, but it is a quote here, "But the editor thinks he has just reason to congratulate himself on the opportunity hereby given him of discovering and correcting some few trivial inaccuracies, which in spite of all his vigilance had escaped his notice in the quarto edition, so that the folio edition is rendered by this somewhat the more perfect of the two, and therefore more fit to be recommended for a standard copy." For one reason or another, this actually became considered as a standard copy, particularly at Oxford, where they clearly used it as exemplar when they made new printed copies to print from. However, it was not all smooth sailing, so to speak, because there was still some problems with Blaneys' work. This is Joseph Parker in 1837, and he testified at the Select Committee. He said, we can see here that the questions or the words that he said, "You are alluding to errors found in the standard. Will you explain to the committee your meaning with respect to the word standard?" This is the question that was asked by a committee member, and Parker goes to answer. He says, "The Bible which was corrected by Dr. Blayney, formerly Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford, is that which is called the Standard Bible." So that's what it's been called, and it was certainly used at Oxford Press as a standard exemplar to print copies in years after 1769. That Bible, which was printed, I believe, in the year 1769, has been from time to time corrected. Well, we're not using the 1769 edition today. Already in 1837 they knew full well it had been corrected. Wherever any errors have been discovered, and those corrections have been put into the margin of the Bible which our corrector reads by. He's talking about at the Oxford Press. The standard then is the Bible corrected by Dr. Blayney, with the further corrections which have occurred in the course of years since his time. In Cambridge, I have understood at present they have no standard, but having been engaged in printing a Bible intended to be presented to the Queen, they have caused it to be carefully examined by many different editions to form a standard. This edition, when finished, I have been given to understand will be sent to Oxford, that our standard may be examined by it, in order that both universities may print not only from the same standard, but from the most correct that can be obtained. Very interesting. In hindsight, that really didn't happen. Okay, now this is, and I'll just go back there, the next page it says is C. Childs. So C. Childs in 1859 at a different Select Committee gives this testimony, and I'm just quoting halfway through his testimony at the committee. He says, "Dr. Lee, an authority of great weight, stated in his evidence before the committee in 1831 a large number of cases in which important errors had occurred." This is in the printing of the King James Version. He says, "I think it was ascertained during the printing of an edition for the King's printer in London," so that would have been either Eyre and Strahan, or then most likely Eyre and Spottiswoode, although I do know that Doyle and Mant were also printing at that time, but they were using the Oxford wording. The King's printer in London in the year 1806, I assume that was Eyre and Strahan still at that time, or Strahan, depends how you pronounce it, that there were at least 116 errors in what is called the Standard Edition, the edition superintended by Dr. Blayney in the year 1769. Mr. Parker, the representative before the committee, before that committee of the University of Scotland, of Oxford, being asked what was the standard edition, says without reserve Dr. Blayney's edition of 1769. Subsequently, Dr. Lee pointed out these errors, and amongst them was the omission of one whole paragraph of 18 words in one chapter of the Book of Revelation. I wouldn't call that a paragraph, but anyway, that was said to be the standard edition of the Oxford Press. Dr. Lee continued, "Some of those errors I ought perhaps to state to the committee, because they appear to be errors of carelessness. Here are 2 or 3 of them which are of some degree of importance," and he goes and mentions some what he thinks are errors. Now, getting on to Greatsite. Greatsite.com, selling this, you can see here the picture of a Bible. It says corrected by Dr. Benjamin Blayney, first edition, revised standard Oxford edition, King James 1769. The fact is, these people don't know what they're talking about, and we're going to look at that. 1769 Deluxe Oxford Standardised Revision of the 1611 King James Bible, compiled by Dr. Benjamin Blayney. Can't even spell his name consistently, but anyway, very, very, good for the sales pitch, but we'll see there's some glaring factual errors. Well, the original 1611 first edition of the King James Bible, and they've hyperlinked that because obviously they sell facsimile of that, and probably that's quite a nice thing to purchase, let me say, remains our best-selling facsimile production. Most people are shocked to learn that the 1611 is actually not the source text used in nearly all published King James Version Bibles that have been printed for the past 250 years. Let me answer that straight off. That is absolutely not true. And what I mean is not true what they've said. Yes, people might be shocked, but it's not true. The same text, as in set of readings, that is words from Hebrew and Greek that have been turned to English to make something called a version in 1611, which is the work of the King James Bible translators, that same thing is present in all these editions. So we don't have a different text. Same with the translation. It hasn't been changed, hasn't been altered. The translation that the translators made, that is, turning from, say, Hebrew into English or Greek into English. In other words, the King James Bible, both its version and translation, is the same one from 1611 to today. Now, when they're talking about the source text, if they mean purely in what we'll call exemplar form, as in when you're in a printing shop, in the place where they printed Bibles, the printing house, and they had what was called the exemplar copy, or the it's like the master copy, and you make from that copies, like proof copies. That master copy that you'd be using there could potentially be called, in an editorial sense, the source of the text. Now, the reality is, and we've already seen some testimony, that the 1769 Blaneys edition was not being used at Cambridge, was not in itself being used at Oxford from the period of the late from the 1770s through to the 1830s, was not being used by Oxford in itself alone, but they already said that they had made emendations or corrections in the margin, and the fact is that there are differences, numerous small differences that can be found when comparing Blaneys' specific 1769, say, folio edition to, say, what is printed in the 20th century by Oxford, and the same can be said for doing the same comparison with what is called the pure Cambridge edition. That pure Cambridge edition, which was printed throughout the 20th century, can be found printed in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. You just take a normal King James Bible, and a normal one, whether it's a little ruby one or a nice cameo one or whatever, from Cambridge University Press. You take one of those. If you compare it very minutely, you'll find there's little differences here and there. Not talking about huge differences. Not talking about like as if it's a different version or translation. We're talking about just in the editorial process. Because at Oxford, clearly, there's a few different variations of how they spell a word here or there, or some other editorial variation. You can go to the BibleProtected.com website, or BibleProtected.com/editions. If you go there, you'll see some examples. Okay, so we'll go on with Greatsite and see what else they've got to say. It says, in fact, halfway through the first paragraph there, it was the 1769 Standard Oxford edition. See how they've given this name, this label, this marketing ploy. Standard, capital S, Oxford edition of the King James Version as edited and compiled by Dr. Benjamin Blaneys, which is the source text used by all Bible publishers. Incorrect. Not all Bible publishers. Not even Oxford was following it properly, let alone everyone else. Samuel Bagster or Aaron Spottiswoode or all the modern American printers, like Thomas Nelson and others, none of them are following the 1769 and have been. And this site only, by the way, is dated to 2017, so it was completely wrong, because in 2017, when this was written, well, it's pretty easy to see that they're just using marketing ploys here, let's say, used by all Bible publishers to print the King James Version Bibles for the past 2.5 centuries up to today. Now, let's be lenient on their 2.5 centuries, 1769 to 2017, when they wrote that. Not necessarily 250 years, but okay, we're not going down to that level of detail here. We're talking about the fact that every King James Version printed, that is, every Bible that was printed over the years, say, around Queen Victoria's times, around World War One, around World War Two, all the way through till recent years, that none of them was matching up to this 1769 edition, and that 1769 was not being used at some kind of touchstone at Oxford specifically, because we can see that there's been changes that have been made even just from Bibles printed at Oxford, and Oxford doesn't really print that many as compared to what you can see coming out from other sources, so it's even more nonsensical. Okay, then the next paragraph talks about Blayney using Samuel Johnson's 1755 dictionary. That's actually just theoretical. It's not, you can't prove it definitively, although yes, it's likely that certainly had an effect. I've written about that myself in a small way, but someone could do a study on that. Not an important thing, but it does show that English was being standardised in that period of time in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, and so on. So, yes, we understand why there was a need to make the Cambridge edition of 1762, and of course the 1769 one edition being made by Benjamin Blayney. We can understand why Oxford wanted to do that at that time. That's great. Now, they say, halfway through that paragraph, however, beyond simply correcting more than 20,000 spelling and punctuation, quote, mistakes in the 1611 King James Bible, such as using modern spellings like city rather than city, this is just not true. It's not true. Blayney also initiated more than 400 corrections of wordings. Here are just 3 examples. I'll get onto the examples in a minute. Okay, so they make it sound like in 1611, there was lots of mistakes in the printing or flexibility in spelling. Yes, that's certainly a fact. But somehow or other, this was all untouched and everything until Blayney came along and saved us all in 1769. It's just not right. It's not true at all. Let's have a look at some facts here. Okay, this is a screenshot of a page out of Genesis, and you can see that the word city, which is here in this verse, is spelt C-I-T-Y, not C-I-T-I-E, and that's from 1637. So, yes, I think Dr. Blayney was not the one changing the spelling of the word C-I-T-I-E from 1611, but in fact it had already been changed in many editions long before 1769, as is exemplified in this example in 1637. Okay, now these are the examples that Greatsite says of corrections that Dr. Blayney made, and how their 1769, is the standard, revised standard edition. Like it's like it's a new version or something. Well, it's completely wrong. Let's have a look here. Numbers 6 verse 14, 1611 to 1768. The KJV Bibles allegedly read one lamb without blemish, and then from 1769 to 2017, that's when the site was made obviously, then it said one ram without blemish. Is this true? Absolutely not true. In fact, that spelling, or I should say it wasn't spelling, that was a typographical error from 1611, was already corrected in 1638, a long time before 1769. So they got that wrong. This is their big selling point, and they're just factually way wrong, way out. Okay, here's another example. Ezekiel 24 verse 7. Allegedly, until Blayney came along, the Bible read in Ezekiel 24 verse 7, poured it upon the ground. But, the printers missed that word not in 1611. And according to these people, when did this mistake get corrected? Because it's now saying the opposite, poured it not. When did that change happen? Well, according to them, Dr. Blayney made this change in 1769. And it's been in our Bibles ever since to the present time. That is completely not true. That correction was a typographical error that was picked up in 1612 and again, of course, in 1613 folio edition. That was a long time ago corrected, i.e. when the Bible was printed in 1611, they already knew it was a mistake, the word not was accidentally omitted, they put it in there, and this is like just so long before Dr. Blayney ever was even born that was corrected. These people just don't know what they're talking about, and frankly their sales pitch is just, wrong. John chapter 15 verse 20, they're saying the servant who's not greater than the Lord, which was of course in 1611. However, in 1762 the word Lord was already lowercase. So it wasn't the fact that the word Lord was changed from capital lowercase in 1760. Sorry, I got that wrong there. In 1762, that was changed from the to his. Okay, so that's the fact. The other thing is the word Lord there, as I said, was actually already changed to lowercase already by, that is before, 1637. So it's misleading here to say once again that Dr. Blayney made this change when in fact it was made by what we believe was Dr. Thomas Paris, although some people say F.S. Paris, who may also have edited in 1762. There's two names that are given. One, I think, they come from different colleges at Cambridge though. So one I think is from Sydney, Sussex, and one from Trinity. I'm sure that I'll have to look it up. But anyway, you can research that for yourself. Okay, so here's the website once again from Greatsitecom. Every deluxe edition comes with a New Testament leaf from an unrestorable original first edition 1769 Oxford Standardized Revision of the 1611 King James Bible. Wow, is that the case? Isn't that interesting? You get this, rare piece of paper. Well, we're going to find out a little bit more about this. It says, essentially, this is their site, Greatsite.com. Essentially, this 1769 edition, suddenly going to lowercase e on the word edition, is the first edition of the King James Version text that we all know and love today. Excuse me, the King James Bible was made in 1611 and we all know and loved it since then. Hello? Anyway, apparently it's this 1769 that they've made, or that they're giving out, is the first one. We're going to find some more information on this in a moment. However, it has the additional benefit and feature of predating the 1880s removal of the 14 intertestamental books called Apocrypha. What is this? The removal of books from the Bible in the 1880s? What's going on here? These books, which they say King James insisted on including in his 1611 edition, which were in nearly all Bibles from the very first Bibles up until the 1880s. So, you do have the full 80-book Bible in this magnificent 1769 edition, just as you also do in the beloved 1611 original edition, in contrast to the edited so-called King James Version Bibles printed from the 1880s up to today, which contain only 66 books. How do you like it that every time we've been using the King James Bible since the 1880s, it's only a so-called King James Version? These people are at war with the Bible. What is going on here? Okay, let's expose this for what it is. First of all, the Apocrypha is still printed today. You can go to Cambridge, and if you're a high Anglican, you want the Apocrypha. The Cambridge University Press sells the King James Bible with Apocrypha in it. It wasn't removed in the 1880s. It's still available. Besides that, it's not been expunged from the internet. Is it really part of the actual books of the canon of Scripture? Of course not. You can see that from the tradition, from the teachings of the church at that time. That is the Anglican Church I'm referring to. But also the views of others, such as the Calvinists, and so on. Of course, the Apocrypha was not part of the actual canon of Scripture. Yes, it was printed many times. Did King James insist that it must be included there? Well, clearly, it even Puritans were using Bibles with the Apocrypha in it if they were using a King James Bible at that time. So everyone understood, anyone that really understood anything, i.e. Protestants, knew that these books, you can have these books, but they're not part of the actual scripture. And whether or not they're going to be printed in a Bible doesn't render that Bible somehow a so-called King James Version if it doesn't have them, because it's not part of the 66 books that are called canonical. Alright, so that's pretty easy to see. This is just ludicrous, and, don't even have to make any more comments on that. Okay, now I'm going to do a comparison, very interesting here, that the Greatsitecom provided us with some screenshots of their work. And so we can have a look at the 1769, a page from the 1769, and then compare that with, for example, a page that's on, this is from Google Books on the right. This is the Google Books 1769. Now, this is really interesting because the wiki source is using the one on the right as its standard to change the 1769 on Wikipedia or Wikisource. The only thing is, you'll notice, whilst the page layout, that is to say, not the actual page layout, but the typesetting is done on the same in the same order. That is to say, that every line ends at the same place. So you can see that the setting is the same. You'll find that in fact the page layout is different because the one from Google Books has what's called a 60-line page. So there's 60 lines, whereas the one from the Greatsitecom, which is their printed one, has 78 lines on a page, 78 lines of text. So there are, of course, examples, if you study in this area. The folio editions can certainly have 60-line text, and the reason for having 60 lines would be that the typeface is quite large, and it's proportionate to the dimensions of the paper, to then have that huge size Bible with huge font in it, typeface, that you can just read it from the pulpit really without glasses. It's quite large size. So there's a possibility here of a case to make to say that the one on Google is in fact a folio. However, some of the things point out that it may actually only be the quarto size and not the folio, which then means that there's a difference between which one was first. You see, when we already read this, but when Blaneys made his first edition in 1769, it was the quarto size, and we could assume, perhaps, if we're using the assumption that the 60 lines is a quarto, then that's the one on Google Books is the quarto, which was the actual first Blaneys, and then the remake of that in the bigger size, the folio size, with 78 lines, and this is just in theory because it has to be investigated a bit further, the 78 line would then be the folio that was made after, which actually then is not the first edition, if that's the case. Now, it may be, just may be, that the reverse is correct, although that's unlikely, but possible that in fact the one on... And the reason why it's unlikely is I'll show you in a moment evidence of why the folio has 78 lines, but it could be, of course, the reverse, but I highly doubt it. Now, when you zoom in, you can see, for example, here, the Greatsitecom, this is just verse 9 in that passage there, which is 2 Chronicles chapter 8 and verse 9. Sorry, yes, chapter 8, verse 9. And what we're looking at there, oh no, it's chapter 7, verse 9 actually we're looking at. It says, and in the 8th day. Okay, so this is 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 9. And you'll see that the layout is exactly the same, even to the point of using the same symbols and, the notes on the side in the margin match up and everything. Yet one is clearly from the folio, one is from the quarto. So my view is that the Greatsite facsimile and the one from the State Library of Victoria, which I've looked at, which is definitely a folio, it's quite big, there's 78 line printings, and the one from Google Books is in fact from the quarto, which shows that that's actually the first Blaneys edition of 1769, and the second one being the Greatsite and the State Library of Victoria one. Okay, so that's fine. We find now, if we just look at this particular verse, I noticed that there was a difference between the two at this place, where for some reason accidentally the printer used what's called italic punctuation. Yes, there's actually such a thing as italic punctuation, and they've used the colon, instead of being straight up and down, being on an angle. Usually when you have a colon after an italic word, you'll use the italic punctuation. In this case, they've used the wrong punctuation after the word assembly, and so in the what I think is the quarto, which is the one on Google Books, has the italic colon there in the middle of the verse. You can see it. Okay, so that's just some by-the-by information. Okay, now, A Scrivener, he wrote a book in the 1880s. He did all this research, and he said that, and I'm not going to go into this, but I just took a screenshot, it's not very high resolution or anything, of some different, what he thought were printing or other errors in Blaneys' work. And here you can see he lists some that he thinks are there. Okay, so the case I'm making here is that there's definite evidence for discrepancies in the 1769, whichever edition, whether it's the quarto or the folio of 1769. Here's another example. This is from Revelation chapter 18 verse 22. Now if you look at verse 22 there, and this is why we could never say that the 1769 is a standard edition. If you look at verse 22, you'll notice that from the middle of the verse, the words, "And no craftsman of whatsoever craft he be shall be found any more in thee," are omitted from the verse. So there's a printing mistake. So can the 1769 be used as a standard? Is it really the standard, one? Well, of course not. It can't be. There's been improvements since, editorial improvements here and there. And other than that, when you compare between Oxford and Cambridge, you can always see that Cambridge spells the words properly and things like that. And when I say properly, I mean to the biblical standards. Okay, now, this is from Darrow and Mill, who did a kind of bibliography analysis for antiquarian booksellers, I assume, to tell them about every single printing of the Bible that they knew about. And here we see that in 1769, the Holy Bible, and it tells us everything about that we need to know. It was printed by T. Wright and W. Gill in Oxford, and it was a folio. It says the Oxford Standard Edition, etc., etc., following the lines of Dr. Paris's Cambridge edition of 1762. Blaneys quietly incorporated most of Paris's improvements, etc. But it also made some of the same mistakes. Okay, for critical examination of this work, you can look at Scrivener. I've just mentioned that before. Dr. Blaneys made his report. I've quoted from that about how he says that he thinks that the folio is the more perfect of the two. It tells us, now this is very important now, sold by R. Baldwin and S. Crowder in Paternoster Row in London, and by W. Jackson in Oxford. Now, that's very interesting. We'll see in a moment. And it tells you like what else is in there, what sections are, index tables, etc., etc., etc. Contains many misprints, probably more than the commonly estimated number of 116, Scrivener says. Okay, omitted that whole clause in Revelation 18 verse 22 about no craftsman. So apparently that's been taken out of the Bible. No. So what we find is different typographical errors, etc. in 1769. It says, now the last part says, copies of this folio are scarce, owing to the destruction of a large part of the impression by a fire in the warehouse in London. Okay, so that's a very interesting point. Let's go now to the next one listed from 1769, Holy Bible by T. Wright and W. Gill, Oxford, and this is the quarto, and it says a quarto edition of Dr. Blaneys Standard Bible, blah blah blah. Okay, now that's it says, according to the editor's report, the quarto was finished first, the folio being afterwards printed from the same type, differently disposed. Well, actually, when you look at them, if we were comparing the Google Books one with the Greatsite one, you can certainly see there that that in fact they used everything the same. Typeface generally looks very, very similar, maybe not identical, but certainly the typesetting is identical as far as that goes, as far as it's humanly, of course, was possible. Okay, so once again it says sold by R. Baldwin. Okay, that's very important to note. R. Baldwin, okay. Then it says it's got the translator's preface, and of course the same clause is omitted in Revelation 18 verse 22. So whether it's the quarto or the folio, the same words were missing out of Revelation. It was a mistake. Okay, and it says they have a second copy there at their. This is at the Bible Society Library, because this is where Darrow and Mill looked at. Another copy. It says manuscript note by Josiah Pratt, etc. Great part of the folio edition 1769 having been destroyed at Woodmason's fire. A copy of that edition is scarcely to be purchased at any price. A copy of this edition is also very rarely to be met with. Sometimes it may be found with a New Testament of a later date substituted for that of 1769. Now that's very interesting, because it says, for example, note 1772. Oh, and it says contains manuscript of Dr. Blaneys' report. So in other words, we can come up with two theoretical views on that. One is that in the years following 1769, such as 1772, they actually used the same setup and would look identical to the 1769 as far as just doing another print run of it. And that would have to be because, for one reason, is the whole bunch of them got burnt in the fire. So, very important point there. In 1769, the Holy Bible, T. Wright and W. Gill, Oxford, 1769, octavo. Okay, and once again, it says unbound, sold by R. Baldwin, etc. Okay, so what we've found is some very important information that we've gone through. This is bibliographical information, which is going to all come together. Now, let's have a look here at the front page of the one from Greatsitecom on the left, the Holy Bible, etc. Now look down the bottom there, it says Oxford, printed by T. Wright and W. Gill, printers to the university, sold by S. Crowder. So no mention of R. Baldwin. What is going on? Now notice also that the number 1769 is actually underneath that writing. Now on the right hand side is my eyewitness first-hand testimony and a photo of evidence to show an actual folio edition of 1769, and that was definitely printed by Wright and Gill, yes, sold by R. Baldwin. So what is going on, Greatsite? Why is the title page of your 1769 different? Well, we're going to find out. Notice also there's some slight differences between the two. For example, when you look very carefully, you can see that it's just not quite identical in some ways. Okay, now here is comparing the 1769 folio that I took a photo of from the State Library of Victoria with the one from Google Books. So you can go in Google Books and find this yourself. It's pretty easy to find there. And on the right hand side, that's the Google Books one, and you can find very clearly, like the one that I've seen at the State Library of Victoria, it says sold by R. Baldwin at the bottom. So a genuine 1769 edition, according to Darrow and Mill, according to my eyewitness testimony, according to Google Books, an actual 1769 would be sold by R. Baldwin. Okay, that's pretty clear. The only thing is, on the left-hand side here, the one being printed by Greatsitecom is not sold by R. Baldwin. What happened? What's going on? Even in 1770, I've got a a Darrow Mill extract on the bottom right hand side there, and it shows sold by R. Baldwin, etc. It's only in 1771 and 1772 that R. Baldwin isn't selling the Bibles anymore, which tells us some very important information that the 1769 being printed and put forth by Greatsitecom as this wonderful first edition of the 1769 is in fact no way a first edition, not being a quarto, and certainly not one of the rare folios being printed actually in 1769, but in fact is some kind of reprint from Oxford coming from some time afterward, because it was only in 1771 or 72 that R. Baldwin was no longer selling the Bibles anymore. Therefore, they are not presenting the first edition of 1769. This is BibleProtector.com exposing Greatsite.com.